19 September 1356. By mid-morning, they were already hungry enough to feel lightheaded, and that made the sound of breaking ranks unmistakable. A line does not fail all at once. It thins. It bends. Men stop looking left and right. Shields drift apart by inches. Someone stumbles and does not get back up. By the time the men-at-arms realized what was happening near the road west of Poitiers, the fight was no longer about holding ground. It was about staying alive long enough to be noticed. They had marched for weeks on half rations, bread so hard it had to be soaked before it could be chewed, onions taken from fields when no one was looking, ale that tasted of old barrels and fear. Their pay was late. Their boots were cracked. Armor rubbed skin raw. Hunger had already done more damage than arrows. When the opposing force pushed forward, it felt almost calm. No grand charge, no shouted speeches, just pressure. Steel closing in. Horses blocking retreat. A crossbow bolt snapping into a shield and staying there, vibrating like a living thing. One of them dropped his spear. No one laughed. No one cursed him. They all understood. The spear fell because his hands no longer had strength, because his fingers would not close properly, because he had eaten nothing worth calling food in days. "Hold," someone said behind him, not loudly, almost gently. Another voice answered, closer now. "Throw it down, slowly." They expected blows the moment they complied. That was how it usually went. Strip them, hit them, make an example so the rest would not resist. A man-at-arms knew the rules well enough to fear them. But the beating did not come. They were searched, weapons taken, belts cut loose, daggers removed one by one and laid in a neat line on the ground. No insults, no kicks, just work. A young soldier near the end of the line whispered, "Are they saving us for later?" No one answered him. The road sloped downward toward marshy ground, carts having pressed it into clay over years of traffic. They were marched that way, boots slipping, shoulders hunched. Guards walked beside them, not behind. That alone felt wrong. Prisoners were supposed to be driven, not escorted. As the castle came into view, several men slowed without meaning to. Stone walls, smoke rising straight into the air. No sign of damage, no fire, no shouting. One of the captives laughed once, short and broken. "They live well." A guard heard him. "Quiet," he said, not cruelly, just firm. The gate opened. That was when the fear changed shape. They had expected darkness, a pit, a yard where they would be counted and sorted like livestock. Instead, they were brought through an inner passage and into a hall where the fire had already been lit. The heat hit them first, then the smell, meat, bread, boiling grain, fat popping on embers. Several men stopped walking. "Inside," a voice said from ahead. This one carried authority, practiced and calm. A steward's voice, they were told where to stand. Not pushed, not shouted at, told. A bench was dragged closer to the fire. Bowls were being filled at a long table. Someone cut bread with a knife that was clean. One man swallowed hard and whispered, "This is wrong." Another shook his head. "This is how they keep you breathing." A third said nothing at all. He was staring at the floor, counting the rushes with his eyes, as if the ground itself had suddenly become important. The silence stretched. Guards watched from the walls. Servants moved back and forth, stepping around the captives as if they were furniture that had always been there. Then the order came. Sit. It was not a trick word. No one was struck for obeying it. They sat, and in that moment, every man there understood the truth they had avoided since surrender. They had not been spared. They had been taken, not for mercy, for use. Somewhere beyond the walls, their commanders were already being discussed. Names weighed. Coins counted before. They were even minted. Lives measured in sums that could be written down and argued over. The worst part was not the waiting. It was the certainty that came with it. But the food had not yet touched the table, and none of them understood how deeply that first meal would change what capture truly meant. They were led deeper, past the hall, through a passage that curved inward like a thought you could not turn back from. Stone walls held the day's warmth. The air smelled of smoke and grease and damp wool. Somewhere above them, a door closed. Somewhere else, water ran through a pipe and disappeared. Castles were supposed to feel empty once you were inside them. That was the story soldiers told themselves on campaign. Cold chambers, rats, echoes. But this place was alive, not loud, not busy. Alive in the way a household breathes when it is not expecting trouble. They were separated without ceremony, not by shouting or dragging, just a hand on a shoulder, a gesture toward a stare. 2 men at a time, then 3. No one resisted. Resistance belonged to a world that felt far away now. A man-at-arms named Martin found himself assigned to a narrow chamber above the gatehouse. He noticed this because he could hear the drawbridge chains when they shifted. He noticed it because the room had a shuttered window and a bench that had been repaired recently. He noticed it because the guard pointed to a bucket in the corner and said, "Use that," as if Martin might otherwise choose not to. "You'll be watched," the guard added. "Don't make trouble." Martin asked the only question that mattered. "For how long?" The guard considered him. "Until you are worth less alive than gone." It was said without threat, almost like advice. Down the corridor, another captive was arguing with a clerk over his name. "That's not how you spell it," he insisted, leaning forward despite the spear tip near his ribs. The clerk dipped his pen again and wrote anyway. "You'll know how I spell it when I pay," the man said. The clerk did not look up. "If you pay." This was the rhythm of the place, not cruelty, not kindness. Order. They were counted twice before nightfall, once by a steward who wore no weapon, and once by a man in mail who checked faces like inventory. Each captive was assigned a mark, a chalk line on the sleeve, a tag tied to a belt loop. Something small that said you existed and could be found again. They were not locked away in silence. They could hear plates being cleared, laughter somewhere distant. A lute string plucked and tested, then abandoned. It was worse than chains. It reminded them that life was continuing without them. In the evening, a man with ink-stained fingers came through and asked questions. Names, origins, who had served under whom, who owned land, who had a brother in trade, who could write his own letters. One man lied. He claimed a cousin who did not exist. Another admitted nothing and said he had no one. The clerk paused at that and finally looked up. "That makes you cheap," he said, not unkindly, "and dangerous." When the questioning ended, the guards relaxed just enough to talk among themselves. One mentioned a ransom paid the previous winter, delayed because the prisoner had fallen ill. Another complained about feed costs. A third joked that knights ate better in captivity than they did at home. The captives listened to every word. What became clear, slowly and against instinct, was that they were not being held out of anger. They were being held because they fit. Because this castle had space. Because there were systems already in place for men like them. Later, Martin heard footsteps outside his door. A different guard this time. Older. He set down a cup of water and a small piece of bread. "Eat slowly," the guard said. "Your body isn't ready." Martin took the bread, but did not eat it right away. "Why are you doing this?" he asked. The guard shrugged. "Because someone is paying for you tomorrow or next month. Because if you die, someone will ask why. Because this place runs on rules." He hesitated, then added, and because I've been on the other side of a gate." The door closed. Alone, Martin sat on the bench and tried to understand what frightened him more, the thought of being forgotten or the thought of being remembered too well. But none of that mattered once the bowls were carried back into the hall, because the moment food returned, fear took a different shape altogether. The bowls arrived without ceremony, no announcement, no prayer spoken aloud. Just servants moving in a practiced line, setting heavy earthenware down in front of men who had not been served anything properly in weeks. The sound mattered first, the dull thud of ceramic on wood. The scrape as a bowl was nudged into place. Then the smell rose fully, no longer held back by distance. Barley, beans, meat boiled long enough to soften even the worst cut, fat floating on the surface, catching the firelight. Bread followed, torn loaves stacked on a board, steam still escaping from the crust. A pitcher of ale was placed within reach, the kind that left a ring on the table when it rested. No one spoke. One man reached out too fast, fingers plunging into the bowl before he realized it was hot. He hissed and pulled back, skin reddening. He stared at his hand as if offended by it. Then he laughed, sharp and sudden, and began to eat anyway. Another man lifted his spoon, paused halfway, and set it back down. He looked up at the guards, then at the steward standing near the fire. "This is a trick," he said. His voice sounded thin in the wide hall. "You don't feed men you plan to hang." The steward answered him calmly. "We don't hang men who can still be sold." That ended the questions. Eating began in uneven bursts. Some shoveled food into their mouths with no thought for heat or taste. They coughed, swallowed wrong, wiped grease from their chins with the backs of their hands. One man choked hard enough that a guard stepped forward, not to punish him, but to strike his back until the food went down. "Slow," the guard said. "You'll regret it later." Others moved carefully, breaking bread into pieces, dipping it into the broth as if they were afraid the bowl might vanish. A younger man near the end of the bench stared at his food for so long that the surface cooled and a skin formed. When he finally lifted the spoon, his hands shook. "I can't," he whispered. "If I eat, it means—" His sentence ended there. He did not need to finish it. The man beside him reached over, tore a piece of bread, and pushed it into his palm. "Eat," he said quietly, "or you'll fall apart before they ever get paid." Across the hall, a laugh turned into something else. A man with a scarred cheek began to cry without sound, shoulders folding inward as if he had been struck from above. Tears dropped into his bowl, disappearing into the broth. He did not wipe them away. He kept eating. The guards watched closely, not with hunger, with attention. They noted who finished everything, who pushed the bowl away, who drank too fast. This was not generosity. It was assessment. A clerk moved along the table with a bit of charcoal, marking small signs on a board. Ate well, ate poorly, vomited, refused bread. These details mattered. A man who broke down now might break down later, during negotiation. A man who ate steadily might endure months of waiting. Halfway through the meal, the noise shifted. Spoons slowed. Breathing deepened. Bellies that had been empty for too long began to protest. Groans passed quietly from one man to another. "This is worse than hunger," someone muttered. Another answered, "No, this is what comes after." When the bowls were cleared, the captives sat back, stunned by the weight inside them. Heat rose from their bodies. Eyes drooped. Relief washed over them so suddenly it felt dangerous. That was when the understanding landed. Hunger had been simple. Hunger had an end, simple. This did not. Once fed, they could no longer pretend they were moments from death. Once fed, they belonged to a process that could stretch endlessly. Every mouthful had been a promise that their lives were being counted, priced, and delayed. A guard leaned close to one of the men as the benches were cleared. "Don't thank anyone," he said. "Food is cheaper than funerals." The man nodded, unable to speak. As they were led away, full and unsteady, more than one looked back at the empty table, at the bowls already being stacked, at the fire that would be fed again tomorrow. They had not been spared. They had been invested in. But the meal was only the surface of something larger, and once the fullness faded, the real cost of being kept alive began to reveal itself. The morning after the feast, the rules became visible. They were woken early, not by shouting, but by routine. A guard opened doors in sequence. Light entered rooms at measured angles. Water was brought. Bread followed, smaller than the night before, deliberate in its restraint. Enough to function, not enough to forget. This was how value was preserved. By the late Middle Ages, war had learned arithmetic. A man-at-arms was no longer only a fighter. He was a sum that could be argued over. His armor had cost money. His training had taken years. His service meant connections, lords, captains, towns that might pay to see him returned whole. Killing him erased that future. Keeping him alive extended it. In the castle, a steward laid out parchments on a long table. Names were written again, this time with more care. A clerk read aloud what had already been gathered. Birthplace, length of service, the banner last followed. Questions returned, sharper now. Who vouched for you? Who paid your last wages? Who would answer a letter sealed with this mark? Some men tried to make themselves larger on the page. Others shrank, hoping not to be noticed. Both approaches carried risk. Too valuable, and you were held longer. Too little value, and you became a burden. A man named Etienne spoke up when his turn came. "I fought under the Count of U," he said. "Twice." The clerk paused. "Living?" "Yes." That single word changed how the ink moved. Nearby, Martin listened and learned. He learned that captives were not all treated the same. Knights were one category, men-at-arms another, archers another still. Payment followed status, but not always rank. A well-connected man-at-arms could fetch more than a landless knight. A quiet clerk could be worth less than his armor. He also learned that time mattered. Ransom did not arrive quickly. Letters had to travel. Guarantees had to be offered. Sometimes hostages were exchanged to secure payment. Sometimes a captive was released temporarily under oath to raise his own ransom and return by a set date. Breaking that oath marked a man for life. "Honor is useful," a guard told him while escorting him back to the hall. "It saves chains." Every day followed the same pattern: counting, feeding, questioning, waiting. The castle ran like a mill, and the captives were grain passing through it slowly, one negotiation at a time. But cracks showed. One man fell ill. The steward frowned, not out of concern, but calculation. A sick captive lost value. He ordered broth instead of bread, extra water. A physician summoned not for kindness, but preservation. Another man tried to escape. He made it as far as the inner yard before a dog caught his leg. He lived, but his price fell. He limped after that. No one said it aloud, but everyone understood. At night, the captives talked in low voices. About home. About whether anyone would pay. About how long a man could wait before being forgotten. "They don't come for me," one said, staring at the wall. "What happens?" A pause. "You work," another answered. "Or you rot, or you die when you stop being worth the bread." No one argued. What unsettled them most was not the logic of it. It was how ordinary it all felt. The system did not require cruelty to function. It required patience, ledgers, guards who followed orders, and cooks who measured portions. It required men who understood that keeping someone alive could be a form of power more precise than killing him. Martin realized then that the feast had not been a reward. It had been a lesson, a demonstration of how easily fear could be replaced with dependence. Once you accepted the food, you accepted the terms. Once you accepted the terms, you waited. But waiting changes a man, and as days stacked upon days, captivity began to erode something deeper than hunger ever could. Time inside the castle did not move forward. It circled. Each day repeated the last with small, deliberate differences. A different guard at the door, a thinner slice of bread. A longer pause before a name was called. These changes mattered more than they should have, because they were the only signs that anything beyond the walls was still happening. They were no longer counted as fighters. They were counted as items. In the mornings, they were brought into the inner yard one group at a time, not to train, not to work yet, just to be seen. Stewards walked the line, eyes traveling over shoulders, posture, the way a man stood when he thought no one important was watching. Still strong, one murmured, tapping a note with his finger. Too thin, said another. Reduce his portion tomorrow. Martin learned to stand straight without looking proud. Pride made a man look difficult. Difficulty delayed things. Conversation among the captives shifted. At first they had spoken of battles, of mistakes made on the field, of who had run too soon. That talk faded. It was replaced by numbers. What armor had sold for back home? How much a cousin once paid for release? Whether a lord would bother for a man-at-arms who owned no land. I heard my captain was taken as well, one said. If that's true, I'll wait longer. They'll bundle us together. Another shook his head. Or he'll be ransomed first, and you'll be forgotten. That word settled badly. Forgotten. The castle reinforced that fear without effort. Letters were written in front of them, but not shown. Messengers came and went without explanation. A man would be called away one afternoon and not return. No announcement, no farewell, just an empty space at the table. Released? Someone would ask. Or sold? Another would answer. Sold did not always mean freedom. Sometimes a captive was transferred to another lord, another castle, another ledger. Ownership could change hands like any other agreement. One evening, Martin overheard two guards talking while they shared a jug near the stairs. He's been here too long, one said, costing more than he's worth. Still healthy, the other replied, and his brother answered the last letter. Martin lay awake that night, staring at the ceiling, measuring his own worth in bread and water. What eroded them fastest was not fear, but adjustment. They learned the sound of keys, the hour when soup arrived, which guard could be spoken to and which could not. They learned when to ask questions and when silence protected them better. They learned that anger was useless, but politeness could buy time. A man named Raoul, broad and loud when he arrived, grew quiet. He began to speak carefully, weighing every word. One night he admitted, I don't remember what I used to argue about. Another answered, that's how they keep you. Not with chains, with routine. The castle never said, you belong to us. It did not need to. Every meal, every count, every controlled walk through stone corridors repeated the message clearly enough. You are here because we allow it. The worst moments came when hope flickered. A name misread. A guard smiling for no reason. A clerk pausing too long at one entry. Hope rose, then collapsed under its own weight. Better to feel nothing. That became the unspoken rule. Yet even that failed. One night, a storm broke against the walls. Rain hammered stone. Wind forced its way through shutters. Martin lay listening and thought of roads turning to mud, of messengers delayed, of letters ruined. Somewhere out there, decisions about his life were being postponed by weather. For the first time since the feast, he felt something close to panic. Not because he might die, because he might continue like this indefinitely, fed just enough, watched just enough, until the man he had been became irrelevant to the man he now was. But captivity does not last forever, and whether release comes or not, the moment it ends leaves a mark that follows a man long after the gate opens. Release did not arrive with ceremony. There was no trumpet, no gathered crowd. A name was spoken, sometimes mispronounced, and a man was told to collect his things. Those things fit in his hands. A belt returned, a knife if he was lucky, a paper bearing marks and seals he could not read, but was told never to lose. Martin's name was called on a gray morning. He stood too quickly and nearly fell. The clerk looked him over one last time, as if confirming the entry matched the body. "You will go under pledge," the clerk said. "You will return if payment fails." "I will," Martin answered, and meant it in the only way a captive could mean anything now. He was walked to the gate by the older guard, the one who had brought bread on the first night. They did not speak until the chains moved and daylight cut across the stones. "Eat slowly," the guard said again, almost to himself. Outside, the world felt too wide. Sound came from every direction. Wind carried smells that had nothing to do with kitchens or ledgers. Martin stood for a moment, unsure which way to turn, as if the ground itself might still belong to someone else. Others were not so fortunate. Some remained behind when he left. Men whose names no longer moved ink with urgency. Men whose letters had gone unanswered. They would be kept until a decision was forced. Work. Transfer. Quiet disposal when cost exceeded return. Years later, Martin would hear stories. A man released under oath who never came back and lived as an outlaw. Another who returned willingly when his payment failed and spent the rest of his life guarding the same walls that once held him. A third who died on the road, free in name only. What stayed with him was not the hunger. It was the feast, not the taste of the food, though he remembered that too. The warmth, the weight in his stomach, the way his hands shook when he realized he would live. He understood then something he had not known before the war. That power does not always look like cruelty. Sometimes it looks like a bowl placed carefully in front of you, like bread torn instead of thrown, like rules that keep you breathing just long enough to forget who you were before you needed them. The castle had not broken him with pain. It had bent him with order. Years after his ransom was paid, Martin sat at his own table and watched a younger man eat too fast. A former soldier, newly returned, still carrying war in his shoulders. "Slow," Martin told him. "You'll regret it later." The man laughed and kept eating. Martin did not explain. Some lessons only land when hunger meets control, when relief arrives wearing the face of an enemy. Medieval war is often remembered for blood and steel, for charges and banners and famous names, but beneath it ran quieter systems, agreements, accounts, the knowledge that a living man could be more useful than a dead one. Those systems shaped behavior. They rewarded patience. They punished resistance without raising a hand. They taught men that survival could come at the cost of dignity, and that dignity, once traded, was hard to reclaim. The moral is not that mercy existed in war. It is that kindness can be used as a tool, and that understanding its price matters as much as recognizing its presence. If this story made you change how you think about power, survival, or the small choices people make under pressure, then share it. Talk about it. Keep these quieter truths alive, because history is not only written in battles, but in the moments when someone sits down, accepts a bowl, and realizes what it truly means.